We always used to say, if you're a professional musician and you can't make a living in London, you won't make it anywhere. It was all live music. There was no discos in those days, and tape music and can music. It hadn't been invented. Without us, they wouldn't have any music.
The guys that used to tell me about the 60s, I mean, you couldn't sleep. You couldn't stop making money in the 60s, you know.
For me, playing live, right from the beginning, it represented freedom. It's like, you can do what you want, you can say what you want, you can play what you want, you can wear what you want. You know, if you do it well enough, people are going to enjoy it, and they're even going to give you some money. It's like, whoa, what's not to like about that?
A freelance musician, like in my life, has played everything. Theatres, symphony orchestras, pop music, jazz, everything, just about everything you can think of. And it's interesting because London has made that possible.
It was really happening. I mean, when I first moved to London, that's where all the gigs were, you know. I'd be playing in restaurants and bars and, you know, the Roadhouse in Covent Garden.
Well, you know, it was Ronnie's, and there was the 100 Club in Oxford Street. There was the Marquee, that was in Wardour Street. There was really a lot going on.
The hotels, you see, all had big ballrooms and dance floors. And so that's where, if you were a competent musician, that's where you do most of your work. Pubs, they had bands. And then there were the nightclubs. The nightclubs were the sort of bottom rung, but they were the ones that could sustain you because they always needed something. I mean, if you didn't have music in a nightclub, no one would walk in.
Ain't seen your baby for a whole long week, so come on, little darling, lift up your feet, let's shake.
No, I don't want to shake.
Come on, shake.
Like, I left school when I was probably 15, because in those days you could, and there was never any question about what I was going to do. So it wasn't a question of looking for a job, it was a question of having an agent and like going for auditions and, you know, just basically waiting for work. So I thought at that time that with acting, it was very much if you were right for something, or you could be years out of work, but I could sing. So I thought, well, I'll just carry on with the singing. And so I went into like they called the cabaret circuit, so I was a girl singer.
I always wanted to be freelance because I wanted to do all these different things. And if you are tied with one orchestra and one job, you've got to do all their main work, etc. You can't get out of it. And I wanted to do, you know, accompanying and duos and chamber music. Well, I was alone for 30 years, basically the only woman for at least 30 years. And it wasn't really up until the 90s that, you know, a few women started to get the opportunities.
I was doing a very broad spectrum, I suppose, of kind of classical chamber ensembles. I was going off, I mean, this is early days, kind of just after graduation. I was going off on like cruise ships with little ensembles that I was playing with. I was doing those little bits of touring shows. I would see little ads for, could you come and play with our band somewhere in a random bar? And I would, if I was available, I'd say yes.
Music that a lot of other flute students ran away from. They kept throwing me the scores and saying, oh, you can play this, can't you? So I ended up doing a lot of contemporary classical music also, and jazz.
Fortunately, I got some really nice experiences and gigs out of doing things that some other people were I'm not doing that, you know, I'm not going to go sing ABBA for a load of corporate people, you know, whereas I was quite happy to do that, and I met some interesting people who offered me more interesting work, you know.
So when I first got here, I did a lot of open mics. I didn't really know. I just thought that open mic would be like rehearsal for me. So we did. We went to a lot of open mics. It worked out great because it meant I could practice in a way in public.
You need sponsors in this business to get going. And I was lucky that one of my tutors at the Guildhall passed my number on to the fixer at the National Theatre, who then started booking me to do loads of shows there. So I worked at the NT on lots of different projects.
I just started going around sitting in because there was much more jazz where you could sit in those days. Just seeing George Melly in this picture behind me, he was part of the scene at Merlin's Cave, Marjorie Street behind King's Cross, which was a famous Sunday lunchtime session where a lot of the visiting Americans went. So I started sitting in there. I met the guys in the Humphrey Lyttelton band, which I later joined, and you know, it was just and people started taking your number.
And I started my own bands really early. I mean, as soon as I left college, I started a band, and the first main one was called Mistura. That's Brazilian influenced jazz, basically, where I was able to write most of the music and do some arrangements.
And when I first started work, I was working in Booths in Hawks, a music publisher, in what was called the professional department. It was Le Fleur. It was part of Blues in Hawks. They used to publish certain songs, and my job was to demonstrate the tune.
It was kind of teeming with musicians, you know, because what else were you going to do if you were a musician other than hang out in the West End? You know, either working or just hanging out in the hope that you might find some work.
I used to go up to town when I was about 17 and just wander around the streets, just to get the vibe, you know. In fact, I used to get my hair cut in I used to go to town and get my hair cut in the West End. I don't know why I did that anyway. But and then I'd go for a walk around, and then sometimes I got accosted by, you know, the women of the night. This would be in the afternoon, you know, walking around.
I got a job in a music shop on Charing Cross Road. So that was right in the heart of things. And music shops in the West End in those days, musicians were in and out all the time. They weren't just music shops, it was a whole scene. Denmark Street, there was, you know, Regent Sound, a couple of other studios.
The music shops were an important hub of social activity. In fact, you never arranged to meet anybody because you just went in the West End and you ended up wandering about.
I'd been bugging off lessons, and at a certain point I just stopped going to school. I think the first gig I played probably at the Marquee Club in Soho. I mean, somehow we blagged a gig there. I honestly don't know how, but you could do that in those days.
There were lots and lots of gigs. There was Dover Street Wine Bar, Palookaville, the Pizza, Dean Street, Ronnie Scott's, of course, piano bars, the hotels, of course, which if you were lucky you could play a jazz gig, but generally it would be much more like background music, so you had to keep quiet. Some of those places, they said no sticks, only brushes, and you had to keep things quiet, definitely.
And then the very first time I was in the West End, I was depping on Phantom of the Opera, which, again, my grandma had given me a cassette of this when I was a child, so there's a sort of sentiment that went with it. And I remember sitting on the bus on the way over Putney Bridge on my way in, and it was, I think it was must have been the 20th anniversary, so it was a big night at Phantom. So for me to be doing my first show that night there, I sort of thought, wow.
Your reputation went up or down depending on with whom you had recently played or where. And the Riot Squad was a band that almost everybody tried to be in, because once you'd been in the Riot Squad, there was a sort of tick that said, oh, you're okay. But they were never really particularly big, but they had loads. I mean, must have been a couple of hundred people that played in the Riot Squad for a few months at a time, you know, during those days. Gino Washington and the Ram Jam Band and things like that. A lot of the musicians that did that would have come from the West End scene in the first place, and then looking for better pay for fewer hours, things like that.
There was a band called Raw Stylus, and I got the call to do that. And through doing that, I met the bass player who I got on really well with, and a guitarist who then I started playing with him. And before you know it, you know, the tendrils start going out of who you played with. And as long as you kind of behave yourself and play.
Because musicians mostly didn't have a telephone, so they used to go to Archer Street to obtain work. It was like an unofficial musicians' labour exchange. In Archer Street itself, which is a tiny little street, where behind the great, what they call the Windmill Theatre, and musicians used to gather in that area by this place. It was called the Orchestral Association, by the way. But that's why it took place there.
Yeah, every Monday morning, Archer Street, to go down there, hoping to get work. That was the idea. To be honest, it was a social thing rather than I mean, obviously people used to get their work, you go in there and say, are you free? Got your diary with you? Yeah. Are you free? Yeah. Okay, fine, put it in the book.
Well, you used to go on gigs saying, oh, I see you up the street on Monday, you know. I mean, there were hundreds of us. No, you couldn't drive down there, it just completely blocked the road up. There were hundreds of people used to go there.
We used to go there, and the band leaders and contractors and musicians used to walk about, and so you go up to musicians that they knew and say, are you working Thursday? And they used to put their fingers in their coats, maybe, and that was the fee. So it's like 3 fingers was like £3, or a well-paid gig would be 5. You know, and that's how the business used to be carried out.
My husband was a bass player called Andre Masida, and he used to go with his dad, who was a band leader. He used to want to pick his musicians up, so they all went to Archer Street. And Andre used to tell me stories of him going as a little boy after school in his shorts, and he'd go off to Archer Street with his dad, where he'd pay his musicians and he'd hire his musicians for his dance band gigs.
Well, I was a very little girl when my dad used to go down there, and I remember him taking me on the tube. It was crowded. It was amazing. All these guys, you know, it was a wonderful meeting place, and they all had their diaries out waiting. Somebody needed a trumpet player. I wasn't working. I must have been 4 or 5 or something, very young, you know, at that time.
And the normal procedure was they'd go about 12 o'clock and meet in the 3 pubs there. And then the pubs, of course, in London used to close in the afternoons. And then the musicians would all spill out of the pubs onto the street and do their business. And the police used to turn a blind eye to the gathering because it was impossible for anybody to drive a car through. But it was the telephone that killed it off, really, because once one musician got a telephone, he seemed to have an advantage over another musician. So eventually musicians all started getting telephones, and then there was no need to go to Archer Street. That was the late 60s, 1960s.
Denmark Street, also known as Tin Pan Alley, had the Gioconda, which was a restaurant which a lot of musicians congregated there to see what gigs were going and pass the message around that they were available and so on. We're a funny lot, we're probably like actors. We'd sit around and we'd say, oh look, there's Lee from the Nice, oh look, there's so-and-so. They were sort of bubbling under bands. They weren't huge, nobody big went there, but above it was Southern Sound, which is a studio where Jimi Hendrix made his first album. And many things were done there. I recorded in Southern Sound for various people, you know, making things. And the Geo, as it was known, you would see people in there who were waiting to be picked up, signed up for a gig, or just, you know, to go on a tour with somebody. So it was a meeting place. It was cheap, cheerful, and you knew you were going to meet other musicians. So it became a kind of a mecca for not only out of work musicians, but musicians looking for a gig or a tour.
Vai ver o nosso amor, não tem razão de ser. Porém, se ele chegou, amém.
But I played 3 weeks with John Danquith Band. Well, for that I would have been fixed by a contractor that worked for John Danquith. Musicians call them fixers. And with rhyming slang, he sometimes used to call them cement, cement mixers. It's not a bad name for somebody who puts things together, actually, cement. But traditionally, we just call them fixers. And these are the people you used to get your work for. You know, they're sort of, they're not really agents. I'm often asked, have you ever had an agent? I've never had an agent. Mostly musicians don't use agents. If you're in show business and you're big pop stars, yes, but freelance musicians don't use agents, but they get their work through contractors.
The most famous fixers when I started were called Chick and Alan. And Chick Norton was a jazz trumpet player and Alan Franks was a classical trumpet player. Between them, they had all the shows and they knew the people through their work and their experience. And they were the ones who opened the first Lloyd Webber shows when I started, but they'd been working for years.
I was a singer and a keyboard player, and that was a bunce for the agents because they didn't have to hire a singer. So you now became somebody that's worth booking. You were bookable because you had 2, strings to your bow. There was a guy Reg Dunnage, who you might say was a bit of a Arthur Daly character. So he would go around to all the clubs fixing musicians for the club owners. Oh, you need a keyboard player, you need a guitarist and so on. And he would come in now and again and stand by the bar and watch us and so on. And one evening he came in and said, I'd like you to join my band. And I said, oh, well, the first thing you do when you're 19 or 20 is you say, what's the gig pay? And he said, £28 a week. And I said, well, we're getting 30, which was a lot of money. And he said, yes, but you're working from 9 till 3:30, and my gig is from 11:15 till 1:30 with a break. How's that? He said, it's a top restaurant. And it was a restaurant in St Martin's Lane called La Bussola. And we had a 5-piece band. One of the things we had to do was to meet every week and add 2 new songs from the charts to the repertoire, which we did.
Love makes me treat you the way that I do. Gee, baby, and I get to you.
Some of the famous nightclubs I worked in was the Don Juan, the Stork Club, Leondale. You used to go from place to place, You did 6 weeks here, and I used to do a lot of holiday depths for other piano players, band leaders in.
I mean, there were so many places that you could play. I mean, there were places, I can't even remember the names of them, but there were like little basements, and I'm not sure that that's still there.
We kind of fulfilled a service in that we provided music that was available for people to, right in the West End, and it was all over the West End, and many of the clubs were like that. So they were, nightclubs that provided music, and we moved around a bit. So one of the things that happened was we learnt lots of repertoire, which bands who do their own music don't learn. So you've got to learn lots of covers, and also things like bossa novas and jazz standards and stuff like that. So it really broadened our musical expertise, if you like, through being forced to have to do that.
You learn quite early on how to program what you're going to present. You need a good opening number, a good closer, and then you pace it, with a ballad, or you have to look very presentable, try and look as glamorous as you could. Very aware that the ladies in the audience with their gentlemen did not like their gentlemen looking at you. That's when you think, why did I wear these terrible shoes tonight? She's looking at my shoes all the time,
But I do remember that at one club, musicians couldn't take a break at the same time because I think it was because they didn't have a license for recording music. So they only had a license for live music. So like the guitarist and the bass player would go and have a break and the drummer would carry on. And I just remember one night where the drummer was actually on his own and someone came up and said, "Can you play Strangers in the Night?" And he said, "I've just played it."
And I can remember one of the chairmen coming on stage and saying, "Ladies and gentlemen," now I thought she was a bit expensive, this one here, but give her a welcome here, ladies and gentlemen. Yeah, tonight we're going to present.
People didn't go to the nightclub with a band. Most of them were men on their own. It was in the days with prostitutes and all that were around. I mean, it made you feel good when people actually did listen to you, which wasn't very often, unfortunately. Some used to come up for requests now and again, but very, very rarely.
But in those days, it wasn't uncommon to do like maybe 2 recordings in the day or a session in the day and at night, two gigs. Because like if you played a pub, you'd be finished by 10, 11, but then you could then go on and play at the Speakeasy, which was more 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, or the Q Club, which you went on at 3 o'clock in the morning. So, you know, and then the Whiskey A Go Go. These are all famous places. Another place was the Temple, where the music stopped at 6 in the morning.
On one occasion, I'd actually gone to bed, and I was actually in bed about 11:30, and the phone went, "Can you come in and do the last set?" So I had to get dressed and get down to the station quickly and get the last train into London, you know, to do the last set at the Establishment Club. Yeah,
It's music that drives me. I almost would say I don't think that musicians should ever marry, because music is a very, very strong mistress.
But we used to play from 10:30 at night till 3 in the morning. So I'd do my West End show, run over the road. West End show was at the Haymarket, Her Majesty's Theatre, doing West Side Story. Run over the road. I had 20 minutes, I think, change, and then you'd go to the back of the stage, get ready to play. The lights would go on and the stage would revolve round, so you were facing the audience. It was a revolving stage at the Empire Leicester Square. And the clientele was taxi drivers, tourists, and thugs and prostitutes, I'd say. But yeah, it used to be 6 nights a week and I did 3. And then my friend left to do something else and I ended up doing 6 nights a week. And that was playing percussion.
So we answered an ad for, you know, musicians wanted to play in West End. And we played some West End nightclubs, one of which was called The Beaches, which we were there for about maybe a year, 9, 10 months, something like that. And this club was owned by the Cray twins, along with others. And there were several clubs we worked in, also I think the Blue Angel was one on Bond Street. And again, it was owned by, let's say, the less desirable side of society. And so we found ourselves in this situation, but it paid quite good money. We did long hours, 9 o'clock in the night till 3:30 in the morning with 4 15-minute breaks.
I didn't do a lot of it, but I do remember through the dance band connections being offered jobs in clubs around Oxford Street and Soho. And I would have been in my mid-late 20s, early 30s, thinking, they're places where if somebody came and asked for a request, you would do it. Because there was it was almost like a scene out of a Cray Brothers film. They were dodgy clubs.
They were seedy. They had hostesses, and I think their job was to get people in, you know, and get them to spend as much money as they possibly could on champagne, which wasn't champagne, and yeah, exactly, and topping their drinks up all the time, and basically really ripping people off. So no, it wasn't. It wasn't a place where you would take your girlfriend or your wife for a really nice out. They were not those kind of clubs.
You had to be aware of what was going on there and look after yourself, you know, yeah. They'd like you to come and sit at the table sometimes with the customers. You say, "I'm sorry, you know, I just do my show, gone," you know. But it's fine, I'm got a lot of street cred, you know.
When I think back, I probably did, but you just don't really see it at the time. I mean, I could probably go straight to the Me Too thing, and I've had experiences, you know, with songwriters, with actors, with agents, and they have been very inappropriate. But you just, honestly, when you're that young and you kind of think, oh, that's what happens, you know, they ask you to pull your skirt up or whatever, but you think that's quite, you don't think anything of it. You think it's a bit weird, but you don't think anything of it. Whereas if it happened now, my God, there'd be a lot to be answered by.
I think for a woman, it's always that dance between how many of your clothes you keep on or not. That depending on whatever gig you've got, that seems to be something that still goes a bit like that, you know, whether you're wearing too little or too much. That's something I've seen a lot, and I think that music is very much definitely a man's world business-wise.
A lot of us were drinkers. In fact, there were some bands you only got the job if you were a drinker. You know, we called them tea drinkers, and we don't want any tea drinkers in my band. So you only got the job if you were one of the boys, you know, to go out to the pub.
Well, for a few years, it was the bands I was in, you drink as much as possible, you know, and it was also part of that stupid macho thing. Now everyone's just terrified of dehydrating, aren't they? Everybody's got a bloody big bottle of Evian to keep going like this. Everything they do, you know.
Well, the Empire Leicester Square, again, it looked very glamorous on the thing, but the actual state of the band room and the band leader having a bottle of scotch behind the TV and the sort of depravity that went all around the whole presentable front was definitely a learning experience for me. And dealing with some of the doormen who their night wasn't made. If they hadn't had a fight.
We got into some scrapes. I mean, we got hit over the head, things thrown at me. I had a plate thrown under a Johnny Kidd, and we were sitting on stage. Next minute, a plate hit me on the top of the head. There was somebody thrown from the audience. It was another one we did with Johnny Kidd. Guy got up on stage and just punched our roadie in the face, knocked him out.
The classic is like musicians, they prefer a concert because, you know, the majority of people, they've come there to see you or to hear you, and that's what they're there for. It's focused, you can perform, they listen.
Shakes all over me.
I went to a place called the Two Eyes, which was a coffee bar where all the kids used to go in the evening. I used to get £50 a night, you know, to play in from sort of 6 o'clock onwards till midnight. And that's where my main work came from then. The Two Eyes, it was a great little scene, you know, because it was they used to pay, I think it was £50 to go downstairs. They wouldn't allow it these days because there's no fire escapes, anything. All the kids used to go, it used to be packed every night. I mean, a lot of the stars came from there, you know. You had Terry Dean, you had Adam Faith, Cliff Richard, Vince Eager, Marty Wilde, people like that, all came from working down the Two Eyes. It was just one of the scenes of the day, you know.
But that was a time when we were playing the clubs and it was really just a way of making money while we got a rock band together, because that's what we decided to do. I wanted to be in a rock band and I realised the only way was to write your own music. And that's when we started forming Slack Alice. That's when we started doing the pub rock scene.
Go through some old stuff. I found a list of gigs from 1974. And we were playing all over London, but mostly in the West End. It was like the Marquee Club, Speakeasy Club, Hope and Anchor, which was sort of up in Islington, on a regular basis.
Marquee was great. It was like being in, it was so legendary, the Marquee, just being there on those tacky, dirty floors and seeing all the names like graffitied all around the place. That was very good. Loved playing the Marquee. There was something very special about it.
Playing at home or in a pub is one thing, but suddenly in a nightclub where the volume level is different. So playing drums, you can play flat-footed on the bass drum, which is how I played. But then from that night, I realized I couldn't play like that anymore because it just wasn't loud enough. So I had to go up to toe, up like that. So that was my first learning experience, you know, having to just fit it and play a lot louder.
There were a lot of us around in different bands at the time, all striving to be, you know, somebody somewhere. And so the pub scene was kind of where we got out, we cut our teeth.
But I remember doing the Golden Lion one time. I can't remember, like a Saturday evening or Sunday evening, and we were upstairs getting changed, and one of the roadies went down and he said, "There actually, no one else can get in, they are packed." They were outside trying to get in. I thought, oh, we've made it. Yeah, pub rock was great, actually. It was a very healthy scene, very, very good.
Tons and tons of pub gigs all over the place. Everybody had jazz night, you know. And I mean, it's still a fair pub scene, but not like it was.
If you're playing in a pub, your audience is just going to be the people that are in the pub, and usually, in my experience, they won't really connect until they've had a few drinks, and then it can go from kind of like, oh, they're not really into this, to at the end they're baying for more. Oh, now you want more because you had a few drinks.
Pubs that generally would have live music now tend to have live sport, so that's changed. Or quiz nights. There's different forms of entertainment now in pubs.
Blue moon, you saw me standing alone, without a dream in my heart, without a love of my own.
Yeah, there was the function scene. We used to call Park Lane Functionstrasse because there was all those hotels along there and those band leaders that did it.
So you'd have big corporate events, places like the Savoy and the Ritz and the Hilton, Park Lane. Fortunately, at the time, they were really keen on having live bands instead of discos, or maybe a disco and a live band. So a lot of those things, and the music we were playing was, a lot of it was just replicating what the disco was playing, but it was proper musicians.
I remember Brian D talking about Ziggy Ludwigson, who was a great commercial saxophone player, but typical commercial approach to music. So they'd be having a drink before the gig in a pub round the corner, and he'd go, right, gentlemen, let's get this little bit of unpleasantness out of the way, you know, like the gig, which is kind of the opposite view. Jazz musicians.
But the money gigs were, we'd play like for BOAC, which is now British Airways, parties. They'd have staff parties at Heathrow, and we'd play at stuff like that, or New Year's Eve parties at the hotel.
Well, the major hotels along Park Lane, dozens and dozens of times. You know, the Dorchester and the Hilton and stuff like that. We'd probably do them 40 times a year. And they were big gigs, you know. There were some real, you know, well-known characters who were guests of honour at some very large events. You might be playing for, you know, 800 people in the Dorchester, and the guests of honour would be really quite, you know.
People are half watching, but also half quietly sipping champagne, for example. And this has happened to me a few times. The first time I was playing, and most of the people were listening, and an audience member came up to me and said, while I was playing, "Excuse me, can you tell me where the toilets are?"
I played at a New Year's Eve event in some fancy restaurant, and the waiter nearly spilt soup over my harp, so that was out. So honestly, you know, the functions have not really been my thing.
Early on, I was doing gigs for a guy called Ben Morris, who had a klezmer band, which was Hasidic Jewish weddings, which were very interesting things. It used to start off, we used to have to wander around with an accordion player playing the flute, which was theme from Love Story, and what was the other tune? Oh, theme from The Godfather. You had to play those. And then these incredible sort of dance-a-thons, really, that went on for 2 or 3 hours on the clarinet. So I got your clarinet chops together.
Every London borough had a dance hall, and in those dance halls there was a band. As I understand, after the war they would be working 6-7 nights a week. But when in the early 80s, and I was at music college, I used to get called by some of those band leaders because they were still doing a tea dance and a Friday and a Saturday, and I did a few gigs with those bands, and it was important you look smart.
It was just a wonderful experience. I was living every day, having turned pro and just living the life, you know, doing my little gigs and learning all the time. And luckily playing with some fantastic musicians. I was very lucky in those early days. 1964, that's when I met Stan Tracy, played with Stan at Ronnie's old place with Jimmy Witherspoon. Ronnie and Pete would book international artists and local musicians would play with them. It was wonderful. It was like bringing New York to London. You could go and see Sonny Rollins, you know, for a month in a club in London, playing with a local rhythm section. It was fantastic.
The first time I can remember, really, I played in Ronnie Scott's, the original Ronnie Scott's, in 1963. And I'd only been in London about 2 months. And Tubby Hayes, who was one of the most famous British jazz figures in those days, and he just tapped me on the shoulder and said, "Fancy a blow." That's how he used to talk. And this was a sort of, you know, an amazing moment for me to be asked to go on stage and play with Tubby Hayes in the most famous jazz club in Britain.
It was a great thing to be able to play there, really, when you finally get a night there and then get a week there. That was, you know, you felt really proud to be doing Ronnie Scott's and to be really tired all the time and waking up early to do other work, but then staying out till 3 or 4.
There was a Pizza Express all-star band played every Tuesday night, and he asked me to put together, Peter Boyser said, can I put together a band to do every Monday night, which was supposed to be the modern end of things. So I did that, and we did that for years. It became quite a scene, you know. Peter Boyser used to turn up with Derek Nimmo, if you remember him, and the England hockey team, which was a bit weird. They were always in there. So,
Pizza Express Dean Street, I used to go there. My parents took me when I was 13 or 14 to see different American bands, and then to actually be playing there from the age of 16 was, again, it was a dream come true. There was a Monday night band of the Pizza Express All-Stars, a young version of them. And we used to get 3 free drinks each, but somebody came down early and had all 15 drinks before the gig started, so that stopped. Everybody used to sign for their money. You had to sign for your money, and everybody used to put the same person's name. Everybody, when you worked at the pizza, everyone put that name, and he got investigated. He was living in the States and got investigated because he'd allegedly earned so much money at the Pizza Express.
I mean, Pizza Express, you know, I'd be sitting playing tabla and someone would be literally 1 foot away eating pizza right there in front of me. And then another person, and it's like, it was really close up. So I had to learn not to be perturbed by that, because that was really strange. And I felt uncomfortable for them, because I felt I was interrupting them, their pizza. I think a lot of people in the audience think that it's one way. I've paid my ticket, I'm coming to watch you. I think they forget that we can see everybody. So it takes someone like a waiter at the back to drop a glass, or someone to look at their watch in row C, or someone to pick their nose in row B, and you think, my God, am I boring?
Nightclubs, did a fair amount of playing in nightclubs, especially in the 90s, when during the period when jazz was in its explosion. I think there was one called the Limelight, which started having regular jazz nights, and so there was the Wag Club also in Wardour Street. They went down really well. Jazz dance was becoming a big thing, and you know, the DJ culture with live music really blossomed in the late 80s and in particular in the 90s. I think my second year in Guildhall, I then got involved with Jazz Warriors, which formed because it was out of frustration basically. A lot of musicians were from Africa or the Caribbean, just couldn't get much work at all, performing, you know, at jazz clubs and things like that. Just couldn't get the gigs. You know, the door wasn't opening. That's how Jazz Warriors formed. Audiences took to it straight away, and there was a buzz. And through that, we were able to play at, you know, really good venues.
Good thing about this is Les Miserables helped me earn enough money to buy this violin. so I have to thank it for that.
Yeah, I mean, theatres, of course, these days is the elite work for musicians, because in real terms they get really well paid now, but they never used to. We weren't interested in theatres; they were badly paid, and it's a bit boring having to play the same music 8 times a week. But over the years, there's been more and more musicals and more theatres employing musicians. As other work is not as prolific as it used to be, playing in a theatre is what a lot of musicians seek now. And although you have to play the same music 8 times a week, you're free to, we say deputise. You could send somebody else along to do your show as long as they're trained. I mean, they have to come in and have a look at it first, you know, and see it. Then you can ask them to go and do it for you. And it wasn't unusual for musicians in theatres to exchange shows. I'll go and do your show, you come and do mine, you know.
I was working with a trombone player in a function band who sort of enjoyed playing with me, and so he booked me to dep on his show. And then another trombone player, Gordon Campbell, asked me to dep on his show. So one by one I started doing loads of different shows. I think first one was Sunset Boulevard, the second one was Crazy for You.
It was really good. It was a really fun thing to do, but it certainly wasn't anything that had been on my radar beforehand, because I was very much a traditional music college. I want to play concertos and I want to just be soloist. And suddenly it was like, hold on a sec, I'm in a pit and I'm playing Phantom of the Opera, and I'm not even entirely certain whether this is proper music or not, but I'm enjoying it because it's on the violin.
I felt terrified when I first depped. And depping in a show is very, very terrifying, because really they've been playing it for weeks, months, and you're supposed to be playing it exactly like the person they've been hearing. And that's quite difficult if you don't play in exactly the same way. So the pressure's very big, and you know, all eyes are on you to make a good job of it, otherwise you never get asked back for the second dep.
Some of the really, really finest players I know in the industry, when they get invited to the West End, they're still a little bit kind of, oh, it's just a West End show, whatever. And they'll sit there and it'll be an absolute disaster, because they'll realise that what they effectively are every night is a needle in a groove of a record, and it's the same every night, same timing, same intonation, mainly the same players. And if they don't play it right and they get out, they can't get back in. And when they can't get back in, they are so terrified they can barely play.
I mean, it was a really intense show. So the score was all around, the drums were in this little enclosure with a perspex screen, and the conductor was behind the screen, Colin. And because I was just first time in that scene, I guess it carried me through because I never really got bored. Never got bored. I was absolutely terrified every single show because I was still learning how to play. Like, open the show with on percussion, and Colin would be giving me the time, and I'd be like, "Am I in time with him?" And then he'd be tapping on the perspex, going, because I'd be looking at the score, but he wanted me to look at him all the time, as well as I was like, "What do I do? I don't know what to do." So he'd be tapping on the screen, and I'd be like, felt really like an apprentice. So I was kind of like just in that zone the whole time. But other members of the orchestra were seasoned kind of pros. They'd play something and then they'd get their book out in between bits of music. I was like, how can you do that? You know, and they'd be passing little jokey notes around to each other and having a laugh and just relaxed. And yes, that's what carried me through doing that show every single night. That kind of terror.
I mean, I remember the time when they would, you know, the brass players especially would smoke and put the cigarette on the, tuck it in the tuba or the, and then go out for a drink with the lads in the middle of a show. In fact, in Bombay Dreams, they did do that because, you know, the brass players, there'd be times when they weren't playing for maybe 13 minutes and they would nip out to the pub and come back. That's like a real male thing to do, if you call it that. Now they've stopped it now, smoking and drinking during the show.
I can also remember one night when I did have too much to drink and somehow taking the wrong door and coming out of the bushes in the middle of a love scene, just walking out, and how I didn't get the sack the night, I don't know.
Your relationship with the audience is, sadly, they don't really realise we're there a lot of the time. The sound they've got in some of the theatres now is just amazing. So it's not even really coming from the pit. So it's not, you're not drawn to the sound from where it's geographically coming for you. It's just the sound, and then you've got the glory of what's happening on the stage. And so our relationship is sometimes of frustration because it's like, well, hey, look at us, you know, we've just done this amazing thing. Like, you know, we've just done the overture and it's really, really cool. And it's like, oh.
I can remember the conductor having a dog that was asleep in my bass drum and playing West Side Story, and I having to thump the bass drum and the dog threw up.
Because I think whatever the show's about seeps into every part of the show. So Les Mis, you know, is pretty much wall-to-wall misery and dying for 3 hours. And it's a great show. It's brilliantly crafted. The music's really catchy. After 200 performances of it, I couldn't think of anything I'd like to do less. But as a violinist and as someone who loves playing the violin, I wanted to do my absolute best for the production, and so I apparently played it beautifully for 8 years, but eventually I had to get out.
I mean, they do get quite a lot of leeway in ability to take time off to do other work, and I think that's healthy actually, because if you're playing the same thing night after night after night, you begin to lose your your ability to play.
I actually had 10 DEPs at that time, and it was a chance for all my former students to have a go at theatre work, and you know, I trained them all up, and the regime that I operated with at my theatre's chairs was that they used to have to come in and sit in at least 3 times with me, and obviously have their own music to study. And so yes, it worked really well, and it gave a few more chances to other people to have a go at as well. Very useful.
Yeah, cut down bands. The size of a band because of technology. It started in the 70s when synthesizers started being used. You could recreate a guitar or a bass without using a real player, and that
obviously changed our business incredibly.
For me, playing live, right from the beginning, it represented freedom. It's like, you can do what you want, you can say what you want, you can play what you want, you can wear what you want, you know, and you know, if you do it well enough, people are going to enjoy it, and they're even going to give you some money. It's like, whoa, what's not to like about that?
Well, the interplay with the musicians, the response reaction from the audience, you know, and I mean, it keeps me fit and you're getting paid for it. Well, sometimes.
I love live because you interact with other people. You're playing with other musicians. And there is nothing more magical than when it all gels together and you hit that thing called the groove. The groove is something that you create, the musicians create amongst themselves. They've either got it or they haven't. You don't always get it. Sometimes you just like, you know, it's workaday stuff and you get through it, and sometimes it happens.
I'm wild again, beguiled again, simpering, whimpering, child again, bewitched, bothered and bewildered am I.
As a vocalist, you can only sing songs that you know. So you have a certain amount of songs in your repertoire. Now I'm fortunate that I could go do a whole jazz gig, I could go do a whole soul gig, I can, you know, but you do get fed up of singing the same songs, even though they're great songs. So the joy is the different musicians that you're playing with will play it slightly differently, and deliberately so, and it makes everything fresh. So that's the joy of most of the joy of playing live music, and also getting the reaction from the crowd as well.
You know, the thrill of an audience, a live audience, is something quite different to a recording studio. And the buzz that you get from the energy of the audience inspires you, and the response that you get. But it's daunting because you only have one shot at it. Whereas, you know, in a recording studio, you can drop in or do it again or take two or more. But that's the pressure of concerts, of course.
I know I'm at my most creative when I'm in my studio, but I'm at my most joyful when I'm playing music live in front of an audience, whether it be one person or a million.
2 weeks with Frank Sinatra in 1980. Every time we finished a concert, he used to go sort of walk past down the aisle at the Albert Hall, the Rat Run, you know, and he always used to say, because the last tune was My Way, and that always started off with a big harp solo, and he always used to mutter under his breath, "Good night, sweetheart." You know, and my knees used to knock with the excitement.
I've come from the Opera House today. It's the most phenomenal venue, and standing on stage, you look out to this just incredible theatre or amphitheatre, and that I've been doing this particular performance, this particular show for 10 years, across 10 years I should say, and I never lose the sense of kind of wonder, I suppose. It takes me, you know, that beautiful wonder you can get as a child, it takes me right back to that feeling of when you sort of gasp at something that you love, and that's really brilliant. I feel really grateful for that, and I never want to lose that feeling.
I've been really lucky, privileged to work with great people, great friends. Most people, they think it's a hobby, but I actually earn a living from my hobby. I just love what I do.
I love working with younger musicians because they have a certain energy, and I've always feel really grateful that they include me in their gigs.
I think now, with so many marvellous students around, I do want to give them the opportunities to do that stuff, because I had it. I had those chances, and it's now time for the next lot to have a go at it, as we put it.
But I play with young people every now and they're so bloody good now. The standard is so high. It's, you know, this college education and the talent that's out there now, it's staggering.
I'm very fortunate, you know, that I'm playing with some very young musicians, and I'm having a fantastic time. So why should I retire?
Well, I retired. I thought I'd get out before I got found out. And also, I mean, physically I couldn't do it anymore. You know, playing drums is quite physical, you know.
I don't call it retired, I call it semi-retired, or another way of calling it is semi-required.
Well, it's just what I did. I hate that word when people say, what's your legacy? Or something. Oh, it's all going to go on a skip, you know. I've just cleared my mum's house out and my daughter will clear my house out, you know. It isn't the legacy, is it? As I said before, there's about 5 people every generation leave a legacy, you know. It's just nice to have been involved, that's it.